Hello and welcome to another session of the Game Mechanics. Today, super excited to have Tom Dowd join us to talk about, game mechanics. I met Tom. We were just figuring this out. It was a scary long period of time. I think we arrived at 36, 37, something like that. We were introduced by Bob Charette, wasn't it?
Yep.
Because I had just come up with this crazy idea for this cyberpunk meets fantasy thing, which I was calling Shadowrun. And Bob was going to come on and help with fiction and game mechanics and help do the Facebook. And he's like, I know who I need to bring in to help work on this. And that's how I met Tom Dowd. And the rest is a small part of history called Shadowrun. But Tom, give us a little update on the last 30 years.
Oh, geez. Yeah. So my introduction to Jordan was through Bob Charette, who I knew through Fantasy Games Unlimited back when I was doing Villains Vigilantes writing, because I was a arrogant teenager who read stuff that was being published when I could do that. Fortunately, apparently I could. So I was with FASA Corporation. I mean, I was a freelancer before started out doing Shadowrun. I was living in New York at the time. And then Shadowrun came out and was a huge success, significantly more than I think anybody expected. Right? I think we kind of knew it was going to hit nicely, but we really didn't expect the people running to get the game at Gen Con. And I think FASA realized that they were going to need additional staff in-house to help wrangle the game. So Sam Lewis, who was the head of operations at the time and the BattleTech guy, basically called me up and said, hey, you want to move to Chicago? And I said, okay. And then went and told my mother that. And since I was an only child, she pretty much fainted. But I came out to Chicago and I was there I was a Shadowrun 2 line developer for a number of years. And then I segued over into FASA Interactive, which was the associate company that you guys did in order to start creating
PC games.
BattleTech PC games. Yeah. And I was with that company for quite some time, and that kind of moved me over into digital games as for the career. And as with that, I did MechCommander directly for FASA Interactive, and then a weird version of that company that became Day One Studios. I did MechAssault for the Xbox and moved on to other stuff. And from there, I merged back into academia and education. And that happened. I don't know if you remember why all that happened, but I got introduced to Columbia College Chicago, which is where I am now, because I did a tour of the VWE offices on Sunday.
Oh, no. I didn't remember that.
Because you weren't available to do
You're saying I missed a good job as a college professor?
I don't know. I'm not saying that. But you weren't available and asked me to stand in, and I gave a tour to a guy named Michael Niederman's writing for television class. And when it was over, he said, you should be teaching. So I started teaching part-time at Columbia at that point. And many years later, the company that I was with, the project that I was with, didn't move forward past kind of some of the initial stages. And as often happens in these kind of situations, the company doesn't have enough budget to redistribute all the employees throughout the company. So I got let go. And I called up the college and said, hey, I've got some more time on my hands. Do you have some additional classes I could teach? And they said, well, funny you should mention it. We're starting a game design program. And
perfect.
It worked out. And I have been there since 2007, running in various capacities, from just a straight instructor in the department to associate chair. Then I was associate dean for a while, a short-lived stint as actual dean. And then the college reorganized. I'm now director of the School of Design, which includes all of the game design and game development and programming and art, and also animation, traditional and computer, and cinema visual effects and interior architecture and graphic design.
Wow.
And we actually also have all of the math and science general education classes under our banner, because we're art nerds and math and science drives everything that we do.
That is so true. Wow, that's amazing.
Yep. So that's, and I one of the things I do is I teach a class called Story Development for Interactive Media. And I found out about this new venture, Jordan's new Adventure Forge product, and we connected up at Gen Con a year ago, and I said I would love to test this product in my class, give it to my students, and that's what we've been doing.
That's awesome.
So here we are.
Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. And what we're trying to do in these is to give new game creators some guidance in terms of thinking about the different aspects of creating a digital narrative game, not necessarily purely an RPG, but any kind of digital narrative game. Probably in this conversation, because it's very mechanics heavy, we'll probably dive more into the RPG side. And it's not specifically for like on our platform. It's just general advice in terms of thinking about games. And let's start at the very beginning of that. Like how do we start? You've got an idea. Like, oh, what if we took magic and combined it with cyberpunk? And now we need mechanics, right? We need a way to be able to, in a very narrative centric game, how do you think about mechanics, let's say, differently than you would think about it in a pure strategy game or something? Do you approach mechanics differently in a narrative game context?
Well, I think you approach it differently only in the sense of the definition of what the player does is different, right? Because ultimately it comes down to what is the game about? What are you going to do? And what does the player do, right? And if you're in a narrative game, the big thing the player does is they interact with the story. And you need to understand what that interaction means, right? What level of interactivity are you looking for with the story? Because it can be very high level, it can be very broad. There are big narrative moments that drive the story and change things. Or it can be very hyper detailed, where every little action modifies something. Every little thing changes a relationship. Every little thing adjusts the story. And you kind of have to understand where you're sitting in the scope of all of that. But I start with like the way we started back in the day. I tell the students, write a little description of what gameplay is like. Describe what you think is a typical moment in your game. And then let's start breaking down, what do you do? How do you do it? And then, because we're talking specifically about gameplay mechanics, what has to sit behind the screen to make that all happen? And I
love the idea of write a journal as if someone had played, right? Like the description of someone playing and everything they do. And I think that's a great first step, because then that leads very naturally into kind of where I usually look to start, which is pull out of that narrative then the verbs.
Yes. Right.
What were the actual action words they did in that description? And those verbs start to tell you they help you define the ways you can interact with the world, the way you can interact with characters. Because to me, that's ultimately what we're building is a set of action verbs that allows people to interact, right?
Yeah, and it's important that you understand, once you have that, then you start to think about what do these things really do, right? Because you can say, just to go to extreme, persuade, right? I can persuade someone. Well, what does that mean within your game, right? Is it a simple change? Is it a larger change that you're going to have to reflect? Is it a simple change that affects the moment that you're in, or is it a larger change that's going to affect the game overall, so that you need to remember the effect of the action, the consequence of it, and you have to build it all. And I mean, one of the trickier things, again, dealing with the students, is that you have to plan all this in advance, that you have to think about it at the front end, because discovery is great, and you will discover a whole bunch of things as you're making it, but you don't want to get 80% of the way through and go, oh crap, I really should have had this in from the beginning, right?
Yeah, I agree with that to an extent. I agree that you want to try to do that to the best of your ability, and then recognize you can never do it. Right. Yeah. Because it's real. And we used to think we could do it, right? I remember back in the 90s, we'd write these 300-page game design documents before a single line of code had been written. And we all realized that was useless, because once you actually got something playing, you immediately rewrote 2/3 of your design. But I agree. You want to think as far downstream as you can, and then you want to build and be able to test it as quickly as possible, which really often needs no code at all, or a tool. Right? You could just sit down with a pad of paper and with friends and talk through your game,
Yep.
right, as if it was on screen, and allow you to vet a lot of your early mechanic ideas and determine it, because it is iteration game. I mean, I think all narrative and all art is iterative, but games are, I think, even more so, right? Because you're kind of touching on every form of narrative, every form of art. So the iteration, the requirement for iteration is even higher.
Yep.
And I love. I'm going to pick up on your persuade example as a good one, because all right, so yeah, that's like, oh, I want to be able to persuade this person to open the door, or to, I mean, let me win at blackjack, whatever the scenario is. As you start to think that through, that can drive you to like, well, what kind of statistics do I need? What kind of data do I need around that character, for that character, and for my, and then correspondingly, what are the verbs that allow me to impact the aspects or statistics or tags or elements that have defined that character in an interesting way. So, for instance, it could be he has you come up with, oh, I need an allegiance number. So I have a value for his allegiance, and then I have a value for my persuasion, and my persuasion has to be higher than his allegiance to get him to open the door, or whatever I want to do. So you can kind of work your way back from deciding that action verb of persuade. You start to work back into what are the mechanics that would be required for your version of persuade to work.
Yeah, and you have to think about, is it a simple thing where I'm using the action persuade, or am I using it in association with something else, right? Because persuade could be intimidation. I'm going to use strength or mass or whatever to persuade, or I'm going to use charisma, or I'm going to use money, or I'm going to use whatever it is, right? So you have to think about what are all those options, because we'll probably hit on it a little bit later, but having multiple solutions to puzzle, and frankly, trying to get past the guy into the room is a puzzle, right? That's
absolutely, yeah.
That's exactly what it is. And if you ideally want to have multiple solutions to it, one, because the players like to be clever and go, oh, I'm going to try this. Yeah. And two, you have to have multiple solutions so that the player isn't roadblocked by any of them, right? Like if you say the only way I can get through this door is to intimidate this guy with strength, and that's not the direction I've gone in, assuming you even decided that strength and attributes and things like that are important in your story, right? They may not be, but that's exactly what you were just talking about, is that it takes you back to figuring out how do I define all of these things in the game, and that tells me what I need to build.
Do I need attributes? Do I need statistics? And if so, what? I think a lot of people start, because D&D is so ingrained in all of us, we start from a premise of, oh, there's these stats. RPGs equal stats, right? And so I have to have these stats, and these stats are going to change over the course of my playing of the game. Well, one, that's not necessarily true for the game you're creating. You're not stuck with that paradigm. And if you are going to embrace stats, what are the stats that are appropriate for the game you're creating, right? The strength, dexterity, health, right? The D&D ones were really applicable for a bunch of guys slashing their way through a dungeon. Not be for a high school romance game, or
right.
So being able to, one, analyze, do I need stats at all? And if I do, what are the ones that are necessary for mine? And that's why I really like your idea of, you start with the story, determine the verbs, work your way into what are the stats, or if any attributes, or what kind of data do I need? Because it's just a form of data, right?
Yeah, exactly.
What data do I need to be able to have the control levers for the verbs that I want to have in my game?
And you have to be really cognizant of those decisions that you're making, because, and we've seen this all the time in a lot of games, is they'll come up with this whole big set of stats, and they're barely ever used, right? They're just kind of there. So if I say, okay, well, I need to have strength in order to intimidate this guy, I better be coming back to that strength stat as an option frequently, right? So that it matters.
Yeah, that's a really great point, because it's not just wasted development on having put that stat in. You've also confused the player, because the player, we all only have so much cognitive space, right? We all can only track so much information at a time, and if you put these stats out there, I'm going to assume as a player they're important,
Yes.
and I'm going to pay attention to them. And then if they're not, you've kind of just wasted my time and you've undermined my ability to really focus on the things that are important.
Well, and I, as a player, I'm going to continually think that it should be important.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
So I'm going to be saying, how am I should be using this somehow. How am I supposed to be using this? I don't understand. The game isn't giving me this option. And you start down that negative spiral of interacting with the game that is difficult to dig yourself out of.
I always view this sometimes that as a designer, you're setting promises to the player that you have to fulfill.
Yes.
Right. And when you put out a particular puzzle type or a verb or a stat, there's kind of an implied promise that those things are important. Mm-hmm. And you should track them and be cognizant of them as a player. And then if you don't follow up on that, it really undermines their enjoyment of the game, and it puts them in a very negative headspace.
Yeah, absolutely. Or they keep trying solutions that aren't necessarily going to work in those circumstances, but they think that they should because the game mechanics have implied a universality.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, setting expectations is really important. If you can lay out your expectations to the player of the kinds of actions that are available and the kinds of tools that they have, the verbs that they have ahead of time, then they will bring their creativity into focus for those things.
Right.
But if you set expectations that are much wider, then they're going to really use a much wider bandwidth of creativity, and then they're going to be very disappointed. So it's really, I think it is very important early in the game to properly set those expectations, to give people kind of like, well, what are the bumpers on this world that then you can be really successful within, and they feel successful within.
And then you have to be consistent with the presentation of those options, right? We've all played the games where you can take an axe to that door and knock it down, but no other door.
Yeah.
Right. And I distinctly remember playing an adventure game in the dark ages, where you were supposed to be a superhero and you had to get into this construction site, and there was a guard, and I had to go and talk to the guard, but I was Batman. What if I just want to knock the guard out? Or what if I want to jump the fence over on that? You know what I mean? It was, and I could do things like that at other parts in the game. So it was very frustrating that the game was now suddenly not letting me be the character that it had told me that I was. I had to go in and have this really lame dialogue sequence with the guard. And again, I'm Batman. What the hell? I'm not just.
I mean, that's an excellent point. And if you need to constrain the player's actions, you need to provide rationale for why, right?
Yes.
Like, which I always refer to it as a kryptonite. That's right. Mm-hmm. It's like Superman can do anything, right? So you end up building worlds with lots of kryptonite in them to say, no, you can't just break through the wall, right? And here's why, right?
Yep.
So for Batman, maybe the rationale is, well, there's a whole bunch of people around and they saw you beat the shit out of this guy. That's not good for Batman's image, right? So if you need to constrain, provide rationale for it. But the default should always be, as you said, right? Set expectations. If you can do this, then I should be able to do this.
Yep. And if I may, that actually made me think of an alternate to thinking about game stats. And it connects us back to, you were talking about, everybody's familiar with the original Dungeons and Dragons, right? It's a role-playing game, ROLE, right? The original game, you played a role. Somebody was the fighter, somebody was the mage, somebody was the cleric, somebody was the thief. You could go that route in your game and say that because I'm Batman, right? I have intimidation. I have this. I have that. You don't have to deal with stats. You don't have to deal with strength or whatever.
Ability oriented rather than stat oriented. Yeah.
Right. And that just comes naturally to that. So maybe instead of saying, and we didn't even talk about if you've got stats, can you increase them? Can you do any of that complexity? Maybe as part of your game, you're like, well, I can be this kind of a character or I can be this kind of a character. And that completely changes your problem solving toolkit. Right? Because if you're Batman, then you get into the construction site one way. If you're the Flash, you get into the construction site a different way, just to kind of to continue that metaphor. And then you kind of think of it that way.
I don't know where I heard this originally, but I think a lot of people take role-playing game and often in their mind assume it's ROLL.
Yes.
Because it's all about rolling dice.
Right.
And that's not necessarily true at all, right? You can build a completely deterministic narrative RPG or narrative game
Totally.
where you don't need a dice roll at all, right? It can all be based upon the choices you make and the interactions and the downstream ramifications of those choices. That's the thing. There is no right and wrong way in any of
Right.
this, right? It's just what's right for your game. And then presenting that in a cohesive way to the player so they know you've set the expectations and they know what's right for this game as well.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about combat for a moment, because this is where many of our games have hit the rock, which is combat can be extremely abstract, it can be extremely simplistic for lore master, where you could figure out which part of your spleen was damaged.
Yeah, we used to call it.
So, I mean, yeah, you can go anywhere in the spectrum. Any guidance in terms of thinking about, well, and then there's a lot of games where combat's completely unnecessary, right? If you're doing that high school romance game, then you don't need to have it at all, right?
Right.
But yeah,
but you could boil it down to punch him, hug him. What I mean, and then the game just kind of resolves it. You don't care about the granularity of it, right? And I guess that's really the question: is how much do you care about the granularity of it, right? Is the hack and the slash an important part of what you conceive to be your game, right? And does it matter if it's a pointy stick or a blunt stick? Does it matter if they're standing here or they're standing there? And the more granular you make it, the more intricate the system is that you're going to have to build around it. And consequently, the harder it's going to be to build it, the harder it's going to be to test, and the harder it's going to be to balance it down the road. The bigger, broader the system, the easier it is for you to address it in building your game in all of your mechanics. But does it matter? Is that what's important, right? I mean, if you're creating a Souls-like game, then you're saying, yes, that's incredibly important to what we're doing. That's why that's what we're doing. And it's interesting, you get into ideas of games like the recent Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. In fighting, punching is a big part of the Indiana Jones movies, right? So you have to put that in there to some extent. And then there have been Indiana Jones adventure games that were less combat driven, more story driven, and those have a slightly different feel. I mean, Indiana Jones: The Great Circle feels like the damn movies. I mean,
yeah. And if we all had a couple $100 million to throw around,
yes, but that's a good point, right? People don't understand that something on the scale of Indiana Jones and the Great Circle is a giant team, years of time and effort, and enormous buckets of resources, right? So you don't have to scale what you want to do based on how you're going to do it.
And we've talked about this a couple other times, but it's always worth coming back to, right? Which is setting an appropriate scope for your life and for the skills you have available to individually or in your team to be able to build a game. And yeah, I'm sure you would agree. It's always like, make them as small as you can, right? Especially when you're starting, right?
Yep.
Maybe set the entire thing in a single room or in a house and have a very small scale kind of thing that you can learn from and complete. And I'm sure you've encountered this with your students. I have with mine over at USC, which is like you do that lecture and then you tell them, all right, good, go off and design, come back with a pitch for your first game. And 2/3 of them come back and say, well, it's like Destiny, only I'm adding these things. Like, yeah. Okay. And then you pull out the calculator and you show them, all right, there was actually more man years of effort building a game like Destiny than there was to build the pyramids.
Yes. Yeah, what I also always say, and it's kind of directly related, is leave room for complexity. That you're gonna start simple, start small, because as you go along, you're gonna add things in. You're gonna build in complexity, and if you don't plan for that space up ahead, you run out of time. You hit the wall.
I mean, you think I've been doing this for 45 years now, I would have learned these things, but that's a mistake I make constantly.
Oh yeah, everybody does. Yeah. Everybody does.
Yeah, so it's a really good one to mention, because you get very excited about what you're doing. You want every aspect of your game to be realized at this very high fidelity, and it's just not realistic, right? Yeah. And so then you end up making cuts later, and the cuts are likely not as thoughtful as they would have been if you had made the cuts up front and put the emphasis where it needed to be for what is truly different about your game versus the 700 other games released every week on Steam.
An analogy that I use is that if you think about it and do it early in the process, you can actually do a cut. And the earlier it is, the more surgical it is.
Yep.
The longer you wait, it starts to become, you tear it out and you get left with really ragged edges. And it's obvious that something was here that now it's gone.
That's a really good analogy. I think that really brings the point across. So something you touched on, which is obviously key in any RPG as we move from mechanics to choices and consequences, right? And optionality, right, of how you approach things. But let's see, when you're giving advice to students, where do you start on those subjects?
Sorry, I should warn you. One of my cats just broke into the office.
I see. Like you closed the door, but you didn't realize he had a lockpick.
Yeah. He's got stats. What are you doing? Okay, sorry. He may come up to visit. I warn you.
Okay. Well, if so, I reserve the right to ask him a question.
Okay. And
so we're talking about.
This episode of The Game Mechanics was brought to you by Adventure Forge, an all-in-one toolkit for crafting story-rich games for the PC and Mac. Create branching narratives, asymmetric RPGs, puzzle games, and much more. No coding required, no syntax, just smart logic written in plain English. You don't need permission, you don't need credentials, you just need a story, a spark, a reason. Build the game only you can make.
All right.
We always have
and consequences. Things that you don't know anything about. All right.
Yeah. So tracing consequences. Let's start there, and thoughts on how you approach this in a narrative-rich game.
Well, again, it's what's the story you're telling, right? And you talked about what are the verbs. So what are the consequences of those verbs, right? So we can say persuade is an easy one. Is it a momentary thing, right? I am persuading this guy to get past the door, or is it a bigger thing? Is it something that you're going to be persuading him over time, repeatedly throughout the story, to produce something, right? So there are different levels of consequences. Some of them are very immediate. Some of them are very long term. And you kind of have to map those out. And the consequence should always be meaningful in that it is something that is impacting the story. It is something that it's going to have a consequence, to phrase it, to put it very simply, right? Because if it doesn't, then it's just interactivity, right? I mean, I like that distinction, between interactivity, which doesn't necessarily have consequences. Yeah, I can kick all those cans all I want in Fallout, but there's no consequence to that, right? That's just interactivity. So really thinking about what are the bigger consequences, right? You mentioned the high school romance game earlier, right? Is the core of your game that romance arc? Then how do you get there? What's the granularity of that as well, right? How do we, and the big thing that I talk about a lot in class is, does the player understand the consequence at the time they're making the choice? Because it can be very frustrating to make a choice that has an unintended consequence. Whichever Mass Effect game it is, where you're talking to the reporter or whatever it is, and like you're given the choice of like, be antagonistic, and you go, okay, I'll be antagonistic, and then he punches him. You're just like, wait, that was not my choice, right? That was not.
Yeah.
We talked about before, right? And you've never done that before, right? If it had been where a couple of times earlier in the game I had that similar choice, and that was the action consequence from it, I might have said, oh, maybe I don't want to pick that unless I actually decide I want to punch the guy, right? But at the same time, my advocates always say, don't just say it with the punch or whatever it is, right? Be clear about what action the consequence, what consequence the action is gonna create. Because ultimately it is a game. It's not
real life, and you can't reflect all the complexities of real life.
Yeah.
Choose which you're going to do, and then make sure you do that in a way that is understandable by the player and trackable by the player.
Right.
I remember playing Telltale's Game of Thrones game, and I was in a conversation with Cersei, and I made a choice, and I got kind of a narrator voice that Cersei will remember this. It will remember this.
We're to remember that.
Yeah, and like the hairs on the back of my head started like, ooh, oh shit. Right.
Right.
That I was like, oh, that is so simple. And it made me so impacted. I'm like, oh, what does that mean? I really, and then later it led to just infinite disappointment because she didn't.
Because it didn't circle back. Right.
No, exactly.
Right.
There was I never felt the ramifications of that. So it set this incredible promise that I was so excited about. Right. And then didn't deliver.
Yeah. And behind the scenes, what it may have done is just change some incremental counter from 6 to 7 out of a range of 20. So it was not ultimately meaningful. You don't know. But the other thing, and we talk about that specific mechanic very often in class. In what way?
Right.
See, we'll remember that. In a good way, in a bad way. And a lot of that comes by the fact that in the graphics, we can't even still communicate facial expressions particularly well, right? So we have to indicate to the player something about the emotional response of the other characters. And that's not even acknowledging the fact that the majority of us can't read facial expressions anyway. So putting them into a game and trying to use that as a means of communication, there's a disability issue there, right? You have to provide a multimodal feedback system for the players so that they can fully understand everything that has just occurred.
Excellent point. And that game was also interesting in that, to me, it broke one of the things we were talking about before, which is that kind of contract with the player for expectations. In the first chapter of that, you start playing a character and you're navigating this character through. And then at the end of that first chapter, that character dies.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't change that. I went back and tried to play it 3 or 4 times. And I was like, you can't change the fact that character dies. To me, I kind of rage quit at that point because I was like, wait, you broke the contract with me. If you're giving me control of something, then you're saying you have control. And I should, and if I died because of my choices, that's fine. But then I should be able to go back and figure out and replay it again and not die. Figure out a way not to die. Right. And so, I think it is setting that expectation.
It's a little bit of an aside, but in the Quantic Dream game, Heavy Rain, you play multiple protagonists and you're trying to find the serial killer. And it turns out that one of the protagonists you're playing is actually the antagonist and is the serial killer. And the game lies to you all the time when you're playing that character, right? Because it's giving you internal monologue for the character. No, if I was actually the damn serial killer, that would not be what I was thinking.
Right. Yeah. There'd be much more gore in that. Yeah.
Yeah. I would not be like thinking about how am I going to solve this mystery? It's like, I would be thinking, oh crap, I hope they don't figure out it's me.
Right.
And they even have a scene where a murder happens and you're controlling the character and then the camera drifts away and you lose control and you're like, what the hell's going on? And then it comes back and, oh, the guy's dead. And you're like,
and they don't explain this by like saying the character had a split personality and you were playing one of the personalities of the character, which would have been a natural way to explain that whole thing. Right.
No. And you, again, later you find out that, oh no, this guy was the serial killer. And now I'm playing the other guy. It's just.
Wow. That's really interesting. I never played that. I remember reading a lot about it, but I never played it. There's
just some really, really interesting things that happen in the game. Right. We talk about actions and consequences. Here's a great one, right? You're playing one of the characters who's the father of the kid that gets kidnapped. And it's the game starts, it's like you're in a daily life simulator, right? You have to like cook breakfast and serve the kid, and you're talking to the kid, and you've got two kids. And eventually you take them out into the backyard. And the game makes you decide who you're going to play with, which of them you're going to play with. And I went, oh, you bastards. Am I doing something heinous to the other kid because I decided to play catch? It was like the ultimate dad simulator just for a moment. But I thought that was phenomenal. I thought that was because it's one of the few times I actually stopped and went, what am I going to do? What do I want to do? Now, it only had limited consequence ultimately in the game, but it made me very conscious of the choices that I was making in relation to these characters.
Oh, interesting. So the which one you played with didn't determine which one was kidnapped.
No.
Okay. But so it is actually the kind of the very, if you will, daily life simulator.
Yeah.
Hard choice of a parent of who am I paying attention to right now?
Right.
Right.
And at that point of the game, you don't know what the scope of the consequences are, right? So you start thinking of this little thing. Do I play catch with him or do I play with the other kid?
Right.
And you literally think, because what the game is about. You literally think for a moment, which of them is going to get kidnapped?
Right. Yeah. And you think this is the choice that's going to make that.
Yeah.
Make that determination.
Yep.
But in this context, right, it's also a nice segue into thinking about longer term data tracking, right? So, which often in games can be something like a morality meter in terms of the kinds of choices you make determines how people react to you, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do they quake in fear when you walk in because you've been beating the hell out of everybody, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or do they walk up and buy you a beer because you've been helping everybody, right? Relationship data tracking. So, for instance, that choice with the kids, right, is one kid to get pissed off at you because I feel like clearly my brother's your favorite,
right?
And what that is every parent's nightmare right there. But it is that, but being able to track relationships through games, as long as you have a way to pay it off,
right?
That is demonstratable to the player. I think very powerful concepts, and different kinds of reputations, especially, can be also very different, right? Something you and I spent a long time working on in things like Shadowrun and BattleTech is the realization that every faction, for lack of a better word, has their view of reality.
Mm-hmm.
So you're building a character that's a hero to faction A and a war criminal to faction B, right? And so that reputation and even the morality meters can be super localized to the kind of larger communities in which these characters are acting.
Yeah, and I mean, I talked a little bit earlier about like the granularity of it, and this is a problem that I'm actively having to deal with in a game that I'm playing with, trying to work. It's a visual novel, but it is okay. So I want this interaction to have this impact on the relationship of the characters, but how quickly do I manifest that there has been a change, and how do I do that? Right. So what I've been playing with is, well, as you get into conversations, you have a set of dialogue choices, and if they like you, the choices are skewed to here because you interact with them differently, and if they don't, it's over here. But now I'm suddenly having to write tons and tons and tons of dialogue lines, and having to deal with the branching of those particular lines, right? Because as the writer in me goes, no, if I say something this way, the other characters should react in a way that is appropriate to what I just said. And now you're in that, we've all seen the horrible giant branching tree diagram, and you're there, you're living it.
Yeah. We talk a lot about that in a couple other sessions on narrative design and the need to prune those trees, right? And you need to, the kind of classic self-collapsing tree structure. But going back to your example about shifting those choices, because this is a mechanic thing, is that if the player didn't know the spectrum of choices available, then they don't know that they're being seen a shift. So so it no longer is now a piece of feedback to them about the relationship that's being built,
right?
Because they don't know what the spectrum is.
Yep. When I was doing it, I originally did kind of the telltale thing of, oh, so-and-so noticed how you said that, or blah, blah, blah. And then I realized I have to be mechanical about it. I have to put in there that there was a positive effect or a negative effect, right? So that the player really understands what that is. And because I'm on another screen, I'm showing what those numbers are. I put the numbers on the screen that says, no, this was a big impact in what you just said.
Right.
This was a tiny impact on the relationship.
And in some respects, I could see people going, oh, man, but that means now I've reduced this whole road notes to numbers. But it doesn't necessarily mean that, right? And I think depending on how you present it and put the context right, it just exposes, as you said, the idea of what has impact, what doesn't. And there's lots of ways to reflect that, right? It can be numerical. It can be like just the number of hearts that float up after a choice gives you a sense of like one heart floated up or four hearts open up or a sad face floated up, right? To give you a sense of immediate reaction that is more understandable potentially than a subtle facial change. And it's more game-ish. That's not a bad thing. We're making games.
Right. And I was going to say, and my choice to put the numbers on screen is the choice of the moment that I'm going to go back and revisit
Yeah.
I thought about, I could have a little bar. I could have multiple hearts, and it goes whoop, whoop, and resets to the new, right? It goes all the way down and comes back to the new setting, or it goes all the way up and comes back to the new. So you understand, it went up a little bit. It went down a little bit.
Yeah.
I got it. Or it went down a lot, or especially since it's a visual novel, you can see whoop, it went all the way to the bottom and stays down. You're like, okay, I'm going to roll that back.
Yeah. Try again. Yeah, I know they are it can be very Groundhog Day-ish in a visual novel, no question about it. And the other thing I think is a feedback loop. Again, you have to construct a methodology for this to be accessible to the player. But like journals and diaries and correspondence that the characters create it gives you an excellent feedback loop, right? Because you can be systemically creating the entries in their diary based upon what happened that day. And then you don't see it right away, but then the next day or 2 days later, you see their diary and it's like, do you see how upset they were when you said that 2 days ago?
Right.
So there's lots of ways you could think about how to provide that feedback.
Yep.
A pretty much infinite number of ways to provide the feedback, but the real advice here is make sure there's feedback.
Make sure there's feedback. Yeah. And connecting a little bit of idea of choice and consequence systems, sort of, but looping back to the RPG elements and talking about combat system. I've been seeing in some visual novels lately, there are a number of authors who are putting like card combat mechanics into the game, right? And I think the biggest failing they have is that they're not connected to the game.
Right.
There's a reward you get sometimes from playing the game, but it doesn't seem connected to the story. So it starts to feel like, and I have to win to progress the story. Okay. But it feels very mechanical. It feels very disconnected. It feels you're pulling back the curtain and saying, hey kids, here's something to do to spend some extra time that makes you play the game longer and feel like you're investing in it.
The mechanic and the story you're trying to tell should be completely hand in glove. It's not an easy thing to achieve.
No.
Well, that's the platonic ideal,
Yeah. Yeah.
In terms of combat systems, mechanical systems, these choice systems, ultimately, right, we have to find a way to balance them, right? We have to find a way that feels like you've created a sense of fairness in the world, right? And that gives the players a predictability of outcome, right? Whether it's deterministic or it's got randomness in it, either way, they should feel that they have a sense of, I have a high likelihood of success, I have a low likelihood of success, right? Give them that. So talk through kind of, one, there's communication challenge there to start with, right? To the player, give them that sense. So let's talk about that first, and then we'll talk about the difficulty of balancing.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of it is you have to think about and we talked about this earlier. What is the role of this mechanic in your system, right? In your game, rather. What is the role of this system in your game? The other thing that I'm kind of wrestling with as part of it, and it is part of this balance issue, is how quickly do things change? I have an entirety of a game that I have to have all this work out over. Well, if I only have 10 increments of something, I only have 10 steps to it. So can it go up? Can it go down? How quickly does it happen? When does that happen? How do I balance the choices of when that happens? How do I communicate to the player which of those choices are doing which, so they can choose to do it, right? And here's an interesting thing that hits me occasionally. In most games, especially storytelling games, the advantage is only ever in being friends, right? You always want to increase there's never there's never good reason to go the other way, right? Like I wanted to see a game where I can antagonize somebody to the point where he hates me so much he starts making stupid decisions.
Right. Yeah, I know it's true. It's a good point. And maybe it's just because we're nervous about, we don't want to create training lessons on how to be an asshole. We see a lot of movies that are all about that, right? That where you can use that as a tool, right? That you enrage your opponent to the point where they make mistakes, right? So yeah, it's a good point. Underused mechanics.
Yeah. Ultimately, what is the impact of this system that you're creating? What is the end result of it? How quickly do you get there? And can you back out of it if you want to, right? We talked about the reputation systems. Is it a zero-sum game for reputation, right? If I increase my reputation with somebody else, does it go down over here? how do you balance that? How do you make the choices for that? And what is the advantage? What do you get making those choices?
And I want to cycle back. I can talk about how we present your chances of success, how we present making people feel that they're making an informed choice, right? Yeah. Because it's actually a really tricky issue by itself. For instance, XCOM is a classic example. It's a tactical combat game, but tactical combat features often in a lot of story-oriented games. And one of the things that it's a purely percentage-based system. So they started by presenting the player, oh, this is your 76% chance of success. And you have a 90% chance of success. But when you present that to the player, they look at 90% and go, oh, it's a sure thing.
Right.
Well, it isn't a sure thing. It's 90% of a sure thing. But then when they miss, they feel really bad. They feel cheated, right? Because 90% meant success. Some games then say, oh, well, what we'll do is we'll cheat the system. We're going to present you 76, but in behind the scenes, we're actually going to make that 86 so that you're actually going to mean it. And that never ends up well either, because eventually the players figured that all out and then they feel extra cheated. But there is this whole kind of different emotional context for how you present your chances of success, right? Mm-hmm. So like in some of the ones we've done where we say, okay, the number itself isn't getting across the idea, so maybe we need to change that into a phrase, right? Mm-hmm. Shot in hell,
right?
Likely to succeed, right? So that people aren't, and also then people aren't like so hung up on trying to get an extra 1% or 2% chance here to improve it, and they're really just looking at chunkier pieces. But that it comes down to your fidelity question, but the kind of ahead of time informing, giving the player that kind of emotional context for their selection of their action.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean we can get into and probably should briefly at least touch on the deterministic versus random resolution.
Yeah, go for it.
But all right, I'll hit there now. You have to decide if your game is predominantly deterministic or is it going to be random. And just so everybody is clear, deterministic simply means that if I choose to do an action, that action succeeds or fails based on what I've been told, right? That I know what's going to happen. It just does or it does not. It's a binary. There could be a range of things of effect, but it's a succeeds or not succeeds. Where random, you're rolling a die, either literally on screen, like in Baldur's Gate 3, or behind the scenes. And I see both value. I see value in both of those. But you have to understand the feel that's going to create, right? Because in a more deterministic system, you tend to, this happens, now we continue on. We're in a random system. There's always the, okay, I rolled, I didn't succeed. Am I going to save scum? And am I going to go back? Am I going to try it again? Is it worth trying again? I don't know. And maybe that's even the more important point is, I think it's back to the granularity, right? If you're into a hack and slash, then one die roll out of 20 to resolve a fight probably doesn't make a huge difference. But it does if it's the one die roll to persuade somebody to let you through the door.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Now there's the weight of everything is on that one single random event, live or die on it. And I mean, I played Baldur's Gate 3. I don't want to talk about how many hours. And you feel at times that like, why am I bothering to even try this? I've tried this a whole bunch of times. The fake dice don't love me. I'm sure the game's cheating, but I mean, that's a reaction to it. But there are also tons of games where that's the entirety of the game mechanic is all random generated responses. And
I think any game that does have a random component, right? As the player, you're casting the player in the role of trying to reduce the randomness.
Yes.
Right. That's kind of the inherent contract. It's like, I'm going to say that there's a random part to the success. Your job is to twist those odds as much as you can in your favor.
Mm-hmm.
That's a fine kind of challenge mechanic. And the player has to understand how that works. And that in fact, it is rarely a sure thing.
You have to give them the means within the game to affect the outcome.
Yes, exactly.
So if I go and it's only ever a 70% chance.
Right.
But can I go and do this other thing? And now it's a 75% chance.
Yeah. You get the better gun, you get the snipe, you get they're out of cover, they're no blocking terrain, so on and so forth, right? To maximize.
If there's never anything that I can do to do that, then I'm always the victim. Right?
Right.
Take the shot, roll the dice, 78 failed. All right. Right again. 82. All right, do it again. Just you're.
Yeah, but there's a lot. I mean, I agree. At the same time, I've built a lot of games that have a die roll in them because there's a drama to a die roll.
Yes,
right. There's a drama to that, which that isn't in a procedural.
Done. I've had to make decisions that get me in the position where it's now 70%.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's something that I have done to get me to that number, whether it's
exactly.
being closer, being farther away, choosing the type of whatever it is. There is some decision that I have made that gets me to that number. So I'm a little more accepting of that number.
Yeah. Yeah. It's the control, right? It's the verbs.
Yep.
Right? If I give you the verbs to tweak this percentage, right, then I've given you some control over it, right? And if I give you enough control, you feel good. If I didn't give you enough control, you feel cheating. You feel you didn't have enough trust.
Right. Well, and that gets us directly to what you were talking about, mentioned earlier about fail states, right? Is that how many of those damn adventure games in the early days did we play where it's Lady the Tiger, you open the door, the tiger eats you, and you're like, yay, thanks. Okay, reload. And we've gone beyond that. But in some ways, almost too much, because there's very rarely a significant negative consequence to a lot of choices. Right. I was recently playing another visual novel game, which it came up because it had the card combat. And in the instructions, it basically says, well, you may feel like if you've lost the card game that you want to go back and resave, but we encourage you to just keep playing and see what the consequences were.
Mm-hmm.
It's like interesting that you had to come out and say that.
Well, but I think it's true because people always look for the optimum path.
Right.
And if they feel they're off the optimum path, right, then they will go back, replay it to feel that they're on the optimal path, which is disappointing in a couple of ways because so much of great storytelling is about failure and recovery from failure.
Yep.
Right. And if you, as the player, have denied yourself the opportunity to fail, then you've also denied all those storylines, right? All that opportunity to learn from it, recover, and go on to greater successes, right? Mm-hmm. But there's these built-in responses to try to optimize. I think roguelikes have been an example of where you just learn that death is part of the process, right? That failure is indeed how I succeed. And being able to bring that kind of mindset to a story-oriented game would be a really cool thing. And I think there are ways to do it, right? That you can, we always say that in life, failure teaches you more than success. Mm-hmm. In games, we rarely do that. Right. We rarely have stat buffs that happen from failure, right? We always have stat buffs that happen from success. It's really fun to explore games where you actually do learn more from failure, and your chances of succeeding later are higher if you actually experience failure earlier in your game career.
And not just in some cheat mechanic that says, oh, you failed this 5 times in a row now, we're going to shift the numbers slightly behind the scenes.
Right.
To make it
something explicit. Yeah.
Yeah. Something that gives you an additional choice or clarifies a choice or modifies a choice so that, again, you feel like you've learned something and can apply it.
Yeah. Well, look, as we wrap up here, I'm going to come back to balance.
Yep.
Talk about that for a second. And it's a very broad question because different mechanics require very different types of balancing. But yeah, any kind of general guidance in terms of approaching balancing for different types of systems and mechanics?
I think it comes back to what's your story, right? We talked about the way you do balance in a Souls-like game is completely different than the way you do balance in something else, right? Like there's a self-punishment aspect to a lot of the Souls-like games that built into it. But if you're writing Indiana Jones in the Great Circle, that's not what you want. You want a challenge that can be overcome. And maybe it takes you a little bit to figure out what's the best way to do that. But then you do feel successful, and then you do move on past it. Right. And when I'm doing the story development class, it's a different conversation when I'm doing the straight game design classes, because I talk a lot about in the straight game design classes, and it's the joke, right? Oh, it's a skill issue. Well, it is in some place, right? I mean, I'm not going to lie, right? So here's my Switch controller, all that just sitting there. I suck at quick, response trigger action games. I just do. And if I suddenly encounter that in a game, there's a balance and fairness issue that is not necessarily accounted for. And it's difficult, right? If you're doing a narrative game, it's easier, right? Because the choices aren't in that regard. But you do still sometimes hit. You were talking, right, in your Game of Thrones game, you replayed a whole bunch of times to try and save the guy,
right?
And that didn't feel fair to you, right?
No, that was very disappointing.
Yeah. So that's the other aspect of fairness, right? Is it giving you the story that the players are expecting, and is it doing it in a fair way that they feel that they could be successful at?
Now, I will say, just on touching on more, well, I would say kind of deep mechanic systems, where like combat systems, or even if you're doing an emotional conversation system, but you want it being driven by, you want the character's result driven by their love of somebody, their allegiance to somebody, their overall mood of the day, all these kinds of things, which can though impact into harm's way response, right? The very number driven kinds of systems, spreadsheets are your friends, right? It's really, my advice on all that is you grab your pen and your paper and you design a handful of things and you play it around the table until you have a very small number of characters and interactions that are feeling right. And you're kind of getting the kinds of mathematical results you're looking for from that. And then you have to go back and kind of back that into a set of equations,
right,
that is going to create different values associated with different aspects of the character. A combat system is the most obvious example, where you have a weapon. You have to be able to balance, well, what's its action point cost? How much is its expected damage? What's its range? How long does it take to reload? Right. All of these kind of very mechanical components of that. And you're going to place a point value on each of those aspects. So that then allows you to create a spreadsheet that when I design a new weapon and I give it a set of statistics, it's going to generate, this is a 300-point weapon versus the pistol, which was a 120-point weapon. And then you say, all weapons need to actually be within a range of 150 to 250. And so I can't give this like fast reload, ultimate range, high damage. It's like, no, you got to start dinging different parts of it to try to bring it back into that ratio. Mm-hmm. And then you play it a lot, and then you feed those numbers back into your system. But it gives you if you have a large, complex combat or any other kind of numbers driven system with a huge number of aspects to it, like huge number of characters or weapons or whatever, you can't do that just through play. You have to create a mathematical model that's going to give you a foundation for it.
Mm-hmm. But at the same time, that mathematical model is only the place you start, because I can speak from experience here. From when we did MechAssault, we did all of that, laid out all the weapons, and when you actually sit down and play the game, the balance isn't exactly what you had on paper. All of the external factors. It was just simply having to aim with the Xbox controller. You had a weapon that was particularly effective, but it had to be available to shoot, and you had to have a target. And if you didn't have a target, then the weapon wasn't as valuable.
Yeah, right. Couldn't keep the cursor on it as it moved. Yeah. I completely agree. But and if you're doing this as a long-term franchise,
yes,
and that's a big difference between, it's like, no, this is one shot, in which case then I'm going to get in and tweak it and not worry. I'm going to abandon my equations. But if this is something like, for instance, like Hero Collects, which we did for decades, right, and thousands of characters, when we would encounter that kind of circumstance, then you need to go back and update and figure out, how do I put that into my spreadsheet? What's my abstraction of that play balance concept, so that I can then have a better chance for the next 1,000 characters I'm creating that they're going to come out closer in balance, right?
Mm-hmm.
Never going to get it perfect,
any
stretch of the imagination, but it allows you to have a better chance of dialing it quicker.
And you kind of have to build the entirety of that system up front and understand with all those, within reason, what all those parameters are. Because again, when we were doing Shadowrun, we had that problem of, well, we did all the base game, we balanced all that stuff out. Now everybody wants an additional gun book. Okay. And everything in there has got to be better, bigger, faster, but balanced. So you really start to have how do I do that? How do I make it so that there isn't, and ultimately what it really comes down to is that there isn't a single best choice.
Yes, exactly. That's what you're trying to do, is make it that there isn't the obvious choice. You want the players who approach it with different strategies to be rewarded for those different strategies and be able to be successful multiple ways. Back to your earlier point, right? There shouldn't be just one way to get through the door, and there shouldn't just be one perfect weapon, right? There should be different weapons, different choices that reward your play style is the ultimate goal.
Mm-hmm. Or perhaps, depending on what your stat system is, the choices you've made with the stats, right?
Yes. Yeah. Well, Tom, thank you. This has been just fantastic. I really appreciate all your thoughts and your time. Any kind of closing message to new game designers working on the mechanics of their game? Any kind of last bits of advice?
I think I'm going to take it straight back around. What we said right up front. You do it, test it, do it again, test it, do it again, test it, do it again. And if something isn't working, then something isn't working. Put it aside, try it a different way, but never lose what you put aside because it may work someplace else. Yeah,
exactly. It's the cutting room floor, but go hang out on the wall for when you need it later. Yeah, Good point. Yep. Well, again, thank you. Great to spend the time catching up and really appreciate all your thoughts and input for this.
Happy to be here.
Take care.
See you.